I am versus me. Suffer the joy.
Perception is reality. Perspective shapes the world around you. I'm JJ Weinberg, and this is my perspective.
Greetings and salutations. I am JJ Weinberg. I am an artist, an activist, an alchemist, an author, and I am none of these things. I say that at the beginning of every episode because we have to be mindful of our frame. Even the things that we claim to embrace, we can't let them be a yoke on our potential. You know, we become what we say we are. Perspective shapes our decisions and our reality. I also start every episode making sure to thank Voga, Barnes, and Denny. They make this show possible. They underwrote the show for me at the very beginning before a single episode even came out. So last week, I know we talked about You Are What You Love, Not What Loves You, from the film adaptation. If you're just now listening, if this is your first time tuning in, you can find back episodes. They are on my website, jjweinberg.com/perspective. I also just found out, Greg let me know here at WVLP, thank you, Greg, that reruns of Saturday's show, every Saturday at noon, you can catch this show on WVLP.org if you're not in the area to catch it on 103.1. But if you miss a show, you can always find it on my YouTube playlist, or now reruns are playing the following Wednesday at 6 p.m. Last week, I mentioned my friend Bart Powers and how I was going to kind of expand upon that a little bit. There's so much stuff I want to talk about, and there's so many episodes that are kind of in the backlog right now, just waiting to get recorded. But I don't want to miss this. It's something I said I was going to say last week, so we'll start with this, and then, we'll see where the rest of this episode goes. So I met Bart in 2015. I was working on this platform that I was developing for artists called Artunity. The reason why I met Bart was because I was watching my feed online. I saw this thing come up. The algorithm gave it to me, right? We've talked about the algorithm here, the good and the bad of it. And it was for an art festival in Chesterton, Indiana. And I looked at that art festival and I was like, I manifested this. In my brain, I'm telling you, I literally said, I made this art festival happen. And now I got to go with my Artunity cards and I got to show up at this thing and spread the message of this app that I'm building, because I know that I made this event happen. Like this is a lucid dream. Like this is a crystalline pattern. All of these things that we're talking about here. I show up to this festival. There was a parking spot that I just missed. None of that normally matters, right? I mean, we say it's just the day. It's what happens. But it put me on a crash course for this experience. It was the same as the experience I had when I first met what I call the Jupiter effect. I was in art school staring out the window. I see this 4-foot icicle hurtle down like a missile and almost kill a bike messenger. I'll tell that story again here later. I've probably talked about it in a past episode, but that happened to me in probably 1998. Think about this, right? We talk about Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl says a human being is a deciding being. Viktor Frankl also says, between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom, right? Now, when you're talking about that from Nazi Germany, that's a lot bigger deal than missing a parking space. But yet, in the world we live in, we get road rage and mad and whatever else. And so in that space, if we can input a habit, a identity, a decision, a perspective of gratitude, then we say, I missed that space because of something else. It's going to lead me to something. And therein lies this idea that I call myself a wizard of intentional serendipity. So it's like just this series of unfolding events that would not have happened. It literally would not have happened. I wouldn't have seen people. I wouldn't have met people. I wouldn't have talked to people that I did had I not missed that first parking space, right? So the first person I see is a friend of mine. We chat for a little bit, but that chatting, then right after I'm done talking to him, I turn and I see this person from the newspaper that I had to talk to, and I wanted to share the story about Artunity, and now I'm like, this is why I'm here. So I was able to share that, and then that led to some press. Then I turn to my right, and I see another lady that I wanted to talk to because I wanted to talk to her about somebody who was going to be a potential investor in this app. None of that would have happened if I would have got the space that I thought I wanted. Something so small, right? And mind you, I'm here at this festival that I'm telling you I created. While all this is happening, I see this guy like 2 different times as I'm walking around, like almost run into me. It was really weird. I'm like, I just felt like I recognized him, but I didn't know how. So then I meet Bart, and from the very first moment I met Bart, I say here at the beginning of the show, I'm an artist, I'm an alchemist, all these things, and I'm none of these things because we should never hinder ourselves by our labels, right? But our labels can also be something, as far as our identity goes, that pulls us in. We think from that future self, not of that future self. Bart immediately, though, starts putting me on this insane pedestal, just speaking all of these amazing kind of blessings over me. It's really funny right now. I'm looking down. This is a real tangent, but I'm looking down at the software, and it shows the end of my audio session with a 0.451. Crazy. Not going to even start going into it right now, but 451 is my number. We'll dig into that definitely sometime in the future as I'm talking about serendipity and things. I said this in the last episode. As sure as the sun rises, Bart is speaking blessings to me. And not just, hey, good morning, Jay. This is a message he sent to me. All my respect and admiration, Jay. Today I believe in your talent, your wisdom, your kindness, your dedication, and your love. And tomorrow, I believe in all of your achievements, all you're going to create and build, and all you're going to make happen in this world. Remember, you are the 21st century, and the 21st century belongs to you, my amazing Da Vinci. God bless you. That's my friend Bart. Every morning I get a message like that, and it's not the same. It's every morning it's something specific and something different. But I met him because I missed a parking space, or did I miss a parking space? So I'm at this festival that I created in my mind. That's what I say, at least. This is my lucid dream. I meet Bart. I walk around. I start handing out my cards to other artists. I'm telling them about, I introduce myself as an artist, and I say, this is what I'm building, and I want you to test it out because I'm building it essentially for you, for us. As I'm walking around, I keep seeing again this guy. And because I'm being really intentional about the serendipity, because I'm believing it, I believe like, no, I hear the voice in my head say, no, you're supposed to talk to that guy. So next time I'm about to run into, I literally would have had to do a jump step out of line the way I was going to not directly run into him. And I introduced myself to him. I said, hey, my name's JJ Weinberg, and I give him my Artunity card, and I'm telling him what I'm doing. He looks at me, and he goes, well, yeah, I know you. And I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? And he says, it's Alan. And I look at him, and I'm just still perplexed because in high school, I grew up in Knox, Indiana. I moved to Valparaiso High School my freshman year of high school. And if you don't know this about me, I've never had a drop of alcohol in my life. I've never done any drugs. Coming into high school, like in the throes of adolescence, not knowing anyone, I was the shy kid. I was the kept to myself art kid in high school. So I just really didn't have that many friends, if any. Like nobody that I really hung out with outside of school. I would draw and paint and read and write and do all of these things, play video games. That's what I did. There were a couple of guys that I talked to very briefly, and it was funny. It was because they were new kids. The one guy, Vince, I also didn't, stay the night at my friend's house or anything. But Alan, I did. There was one time that I stayed the night at Alan's house with Vince in high school. And so I'm like, wow, this is really crazy. And he goes, I'm not even kidding you. He said to me these words, "You have to come talk to my mom. You're the reason this art festival is happening." I'm left that pause there. I know you're not supposed to do that on radio because you don't know that this next part's coming. But can you believe that? He said to me that he reflected back to me that exact thing that I said to myself in my head. I created this experience. I created this art festival. But Alan was literally repeating it back to me that I was the reason that it was happening. Well, the festival is called Hooked on Arts. And his mom was one of the founders of this festival, and it was about using arts for recovery. And so I went over, and I'm like, now I'm remembering his mom. I'm remembering like going to his house a couple of times, and even conversations that I had with his mom where she was asking me, like, because she saw me as, the adolescent teenager boy that was an anomaly because I wasn't rebellious in the slightest at that time. I wasn't drinking or smoking or doing drugs or any of those things. And she was like, why not? Not like why not, like everybody should be, but she was trying to understand why I had no desire to do these things. And I told her about just kind of this idea that aspiration was cultivated in me. And then I talked to her about this idea of a tree and the roots and the fruits. And I remember it. And it was really, all of that stuff that happened. And when I was talking to her, it was that conversation that helped her mold the idea through creativity and through cultivating aspiration, essentially. Thankfully, I listened to that whisper because then I went up to him and said, here's my card. And then he reaffirmed that quite literally a 17-year-old version of me was part of what brought that experience to pass, which is also what, of course, brought Bart to that experience, which is why Bart is now in my experience every day, reaffirming this intentional serendipity, reaffirming this quantum version of myself that is, as Bart puts it, in the winner's limousine. So anyway, that is Bart Powers. I hope you can find a Bart Powers in your life. So last week I mentioned this experience I had also on November 24th that I wanted to get to. So before we get too far away from it, I want to set up a frame that's going to matter for understanding it, though. So we just got done talking about Bart Powers, and on this show I mentioned serendipity all the time, synchronicity. But I want to widen the lens for a moment. I was listening to this Alan Watts lecture just recently, and he was kind of warning against becoming arrested by a special serendipity, this idea of specialness. It's more about not that it's not special, but being frozen in a posture of waiting for the universe to validate us, because we treat synchronicity as some cosmic pat on the head. Sometimes we might miss what it's actually doing. And it's not saying you are chosen, it's saying you are everything. It's returning you to the truth that the boundary that you draw between yourself and the world is convenient but fictional. Again, this idea that we'll talk about here, the notion that you have separated yourself between you and everything that isn't you. It might sound like humility to say that you aren't everything and that you aren't involved with this collective unconscious and you aren't the lucid dreamer. But maybe we change the frame again, change the perspective. What does that mean to say that it's just you and then there's everything else? That seems like maybe a potential false perspective and maybe more vain than assuming that you're a part of a much larger organism. So in it, Watts uses this phrase that's very familiar to my experience. He says something about the future cast a shadow back into his sleeping mind. This is that lucidity. For a moment, time revealed itself as something other than a straight line. Synchronicity is not merely a connection across space, it's a connection across time. Past, present, and future are not separate zones. We've talked about this before, just being present in all of these layers. Patterns interacting with each other in ways that our linear minds can barely register. And then we have this chain of causality. We miss the point, and we miss the acausal, as Carl Jung would say it, experience in our life that is synchronicity. It's a language, perhaps, that our future self uses to communicate with us in the present. So synchronicity isn't happening to you, it's happening from you. It's something you are, the same way that you come out of the earth. You come out of this cosmos and this experience. You didn't come into it. You blossom out of it like an apple. So then I see again, serendipity, like gratitude, is a decision, not an external telegram from the universe. It's the dissolving of the illusion that you're this tiny, isolated creature in a vast external world. Once the boundary drops, once you see that the air you breathe literally becomes your blood and your thoughts, that the food you eat becomes your body, like Gibran says, on eating and drinking, you realize you and the world rise from the same source. The apple comes from the environment, and so do you. So synchronicity becomes a mirror, not a mystery to be solved, not a scavenger hunt, but a reflection of the pattern you're already living. The intelligence behind synchronicity is not outside of you, it's your quantum self dropping breadcrumbs, clues, little love notes folded into circumstance. And you're not following someone else's trail, you're retracing your own. So one of the most impactful lines in this thing I was listening to, Alan Watts says, "It was never about the universe sending you messages. It was about the universe waking up to itself through you. Every meaningful coincidence, a crack in the illusion of separation." And Alan Watts has talked about this before. I talk about this all the time. It's like dreaming and forgetting you're the dreamer. I often say this here too, and I think about this a lot, reframing that something happens for us rather than to us. It takes us out of the victimhood mentality and reframes us as authors of the experience. I heard something recently, though, that said it doesn't happen to us, but it happens through us, which I'm going to get into that on my episode on forgiveness. We're going to talk about forgiveness here soon, and the idea that forgiveness happens through us and how perspective changes, how we can change the past from the present. A lot of stuff to go into there. But I want to talk about November 24th. I'm reading from my notes, and I was riding with Clinton in the car, and it's set up so perfectly. The end of my song, I just now realized it. I thought it was about Joan Osborne, who covered the song, "What If God Was One of Us?" But now I realize it's about Joan Kowalski. Kowalski being called on the phone. It's like a challenge. Okay, I'm going to skip the rest of this right now. I'll come back and do a whole episode just on this because there's so much here. But to skip forward, I look down and I'm overwhelmed. I see this little stone, black polished hematite. It's the tears of forgotten dreams in Fromoville. So for my Bobberverse, my Bob Ross metaverse, I have these different crystals and gemstones. The Jupiter stone in Fromoville is something that the killer Kowalski comes to try and cleave away from because it represents what we've talked about here, your crystal, the pattern of imagination and love and creativity. And when you cleave off some of the Jupiter stone, you get those properties. If you have a piece of the Jupiter crystal in your pocket, it will help you manifest serendipity, right? So the killer Kowalski and his band of vampire space pirates, they're always trying to come and cleave away pieces of the stone. But when a person that's not worthy tries to cleave away from the Jupiter stone, it pools into this metallic hematite. And as I'm walking to try and get this stuff to fix my car, my broken down car, I see one of these tears right here on the ground, like manifested for me. But that takes me to this notion of narcissism. It's something that I've been accused of, and I try to be aware of, try to have some self-awareness. And we said it here before, greatness in any capacity requires belief in yourself. A couple episodes back, I think it was, when I talked about this notion of whether you believe you can or believe you can't, you're right. The believe you can't part is almost guaranteed. It doesn't take a lot of energy because in that space that Viktor Frankl talks about where you have the power to choose, you've chosen that you can't. And the world's not really going to be there to kind of prove you wrong on that. I mean, sometimes it does, surprisingly. But overarchingly, you're going to find you're really right with you can't. But to get to greatness, you have to believe in that greatness. In the unhealthy way, if it manifests as narcissism, it can look like a delusion of grandeur, right? But that's also another thing that I often say to people. More than anything, I see that the delusion isn't of grandeur, but the delusion is of mediocrity. The delusion is of, I can't. If you go back a couple episodes, it's Mr. Hatch looking down at his feet. So when we talk about ego and I am versus me, I think we can maybe get a little bit of an articulation here. So back when I would do just the video podcast of Perspective on YouTube, I would talk often with my friend Dr. Gary Penn. He's a psychologist in Los Angeles. If you want to hear some of those early conversations again, you can go to jjweinberg.com/perspective. Gary and I have covered a lot of terrain together, and one of the recurring threads is this thing that we drag around a lot and have this slippery creature that people call ego. We also talk about anger. Anger can be a bunch of different things, but when it comes to ego and it comes up in a public square, it often gets flattened into a cartoon villain. Ego is bad. Ego ruins people. Ego sets your life on fire. But even with fire, like if the fire is anger, there's such a thing as righteous anger, and there's such a thing as an ego as the I am version of that declaration pulling you to your identity, to your greatness, to that crystalline pattern. So, fire is essentially neutral. Fire is possibility. So fire can burn down a house, of course, but fire can also warm the house. Fire cooks the dinner. Fire propels the engine. So fire is destruction when unmanaged. Fire can become transcendent when directed. And Gary and I have always agreed on this. We had both been saying the same thing before we met each other for decades, and then we come together and say, oh, wow, that's exactly the point of view I say about that with fire, and that's such a case with anger. So another Viktor Frankl, we come back to Viktor Frankl a lot, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation can be considered normal behavior. So if you're righteously angry about something, you have every right to be angry, and to stomp down that anger would be potentially something that the gaslighter is doing. You shouldn't be angry. Why are you angry? Now you're angry at me for smacking you in the face. Of course I'm angry at you for smacking me in the face. Now I can forgive you and we can go down that whole line of things, but an abnormal reaction to abnormal situation can be considered and should be considered normal behavior. So it reminds me, in 2020, one of the first episodes of the podcast, I talked about one of my favorite authors, Khalil Gibran, the prophet. This exact excerpt, though, I think is from Madman, and it's called The Wise King. There's actually some false attribution to Paulo Coelho. Paulo Coelho's, he's great, but he's not Khalil Gibran. And he pulled it from Khalil Gibran. So we should definitely try and get as close as we can to the source. But The Wise King, I'll just read it right from the script from the book. Once there ruled in the distant city of Wurani a king who was wise and good, and he was feared and loved by all of his subjects. Now in the heart of that city was a well, whose water was cool and crystalline, and from which all the inhabitants drank, even the king and his courtiers, for there was no other well. Upon a certain night, when all were asleep, a witch entered the city and poured 7 drops of a strange liquid into the well and said, "From this hour, he who drinks of this water shall become mad." The next morning, all of the inhabitants of the city, save the king and his lord chamberlain, drank from the well and became mad, even as the witch had foretold. And during that day, the people in the narrow streets and the marketplaces did not but whisper to one another, "The king is mad. Our king and his lord chamberlain have lost their reason. Certes, we cannot be ruled by a mad king. We must dethrone him." That evening, the king ordered a golden goblet to be filled from the well. And when it was brought to him, he drank deeply and gave it to his lord chamberlain to drink. And then there was great rejoicing in the distant city of Wurani, because its king and its lord chamberlain had regained their reason. I love this parable about perspective. The king was mad. The king had gone mad because all of the people were mad. And then once the king became mad along with them, he had regained his reason. So there's a reason sometimes for righteous anger. There's a reason sometimes that you might need a little bit of that pull from your future greatness. I mean, imagine Muhammad Ali. Great example. Is it ego or is it clarity? So my friend Gary Penn, we'll have him on the radio show here in the future for sure. He and his wife, Janine, also a great friend of mine. Beautiful people. They have their own show. As soon as I know where it's at and there's links, I'll make sure and mention it. Also want to mention the rest of the programming here. On WVLP, we have some amazing perspectives. So check out the rest of the crew. And we're going to be doing some fun stuff here in the coming year, 2026. But Gary and I, we've always agreed that a lot of our culture confuses the uncontrolled flame with the element itself. We confuse the injury with the instrument, like we do with anger. People talk about it only like it's a character flaw rather than sometimes an indicator light. And there's undoubtedly destructive anger. It's the kind we see the most, the kind that lashes outward like a loose electrical wire. But righteous, healthy, clarifying anger is the kind that says, I may not be safe here. Something's wrong. And when Viktor Frankl hints at that paradox, saying an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior, it's saying if the prison is insane, the prisoner's cry is sanity. If the world is bent, the straight line looks rebellious. Which brings me to the distinction that I wanted to talk about. It's funny because I heard Matthew McConaughey talk about it, essentially what we're going to say here, on Theo Vaughn's show recently. But they went past it really quickly, and I wanted to anchor down more on it. And it's the difference between me and I. So again, on the surface, those two words might sound interchangeable, but one is like a cage of ego, and the other is the kingdom of clarity. This me is ego, the brittle me. Look at me, look at what me, look at me, look at me, look at me. That fear-based defensive ego, that ego that's starving, insecure, endlessly comparing. The me that's a running tally of grievances, the list of ways you've been slighted, the me that gets cut off in traffic and immediately loses all of that space that Viktor Frankl says for us to choose and decide, and gets road rage. That's been me for sure, in many different times in my life. The fragile persona that needs applause just to stay upright. That's the me that collapses under judgment and inflates under praise, and treats every moment as a referendum on its worth. But I is something entirely different. I am that I am. I is a statement of being. It's identity at the level of source. It's the articulation of the quantum self. My brother, he had sent me this video recently with Butterbean, the boxer, the big boxer guy, bald, and he was big. We'll just say that. But his health really declined. He was in a wheelchair, couldn't stand up straight. He went to Diamond Dallas Page, an old wrestler, to kind of get into this rehab about trying to build strength in his body. And so it's really inspiring to see him make this transformation. He gets his hip was fused together. He loses all this weight, so he's able to, get the surgery on his hip. And my brother sent that to me, and I said, yeah, imagine what's possible for me and you with this head start that we have on Butterbean right now. And I said, I'm so glad that you're in the gym right now. And it reminded me of stuff that we've talked about here, where, like I said, consistency doesn't stem from a forced discipline. It's something that I've talked about here on this show. It comes from taking the quantum leap into the person that you see yourself as. It's identity crystallizing by the pattern of behavior and seeing now as the future's memory. Neville Goddard says, by imagination, we have the power to be anything we desire to be. Through imagination, we disarm and transform the violence of the world. And it just keeps coming back around to perception is reality. So identity, the articulation of self, the declaration of the crystal, the Jupiter stone, the pattern that you're willing to inhabit. This is what we see in I am, the I versus the me. It's the quiet sovereign center that Neville Goddard talks about when he says that imagination is not a daydream, but the blueprint of your becoming. And we've talked before about Einstein saying imagination is more important than knowledge. Why? Of all people, why would he say that? The I doesn't ask for permission. The I am. The I doesn't need to prove anything. The I is the flame brought under mastery. So very easy to think about people like Picasso or Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali didn't become the greatest by accident. He said, I am the greatest, long before the world agreed with him. But was the phrase arrogance or was it alignment? Was it the self speaking from its destination and not its present limitation? Or was it ego, me? I think it was the I rising above the me. The me just says, look at me, but the I says, this is who I am. The me is hungry, the I is whole, satiated by clarity. The me is reactive, the I is responsive. The me seeks validation, the I seeks expression. So once we understand this distinction, ego can stop being the monster that you have to wrestle with and becomes an instrument that you can fine-tune. Fire remains fire, but you become the one who decides whether it burns down your house, burns down your life, or lights the path ahead of you. Probably a telltale sign when you're speaking through the me, everything will feel scarce. And when you speak from the I, everything feels possible. The me carries fear into the room, the I carries purpose. The irony is that most people think they're too egotistical when in reality they're starving for a deeper I. Like I said, the delusion isn't of grandeur. The delusions of mediocrity. If you look at the scientific, statistical calculation of your specific existence, your parents coming into the world, their parents coming into the world, their parents meeting, your parents meeting, on and on and on. If you look at and were to calculate that, your individual existence with your exact makeup, both nature and nurture, because it's a combination of things that make up who you are, and your spirit rumbling through all of this, you are an impossibility. Your statistical possibility of existence, they would say it's statistically impossible. Okay? So the delusion isn't of grandeur. You are a walking miracle. And I don't mean that like a participation trophy, right? Because if you lose that gap that Viktor Frankl talks about between the stimulus and your response, you become an automaton. You become systemized. And you let go and you give away your greatest gift. And we have to always be conscious that that's not happening with us. But the delusion is of mediocrity. You're not suffering from too much ego. You're suffering from a malnourished sense of being. Who are you? That's the question. Who are you? When the lights go out, when no one's around, who are you? That's your crystalline self. So it's about learning to hear the difference, to know when the me is panicking and when the I is calling you forward. So recognizing the I versus the me is like recognizing when your anger is a house fire and when it's a spark that could warm and light the night. Because your life is always shaped by the voice you believe in, the perspective. And one of those voices can shrink you, and another can expand you. and the people around you. They put expectations on you. That's why at the beginning of these shows, I say, here I am. I'm JJ Weinberg. I'm an artist. I'm an activist. I'm an alchemist. I'm an author. And I'm none of these things. Because people can have an expectation of me. Oh, you're an artist? Well, then that means you're like this. That means you're like that. That means you voted this way. That means you go to and believe and pray in this God. That means you have this kind of a lifestyle and relationship with drugs and alcohol and all these different things. There are different patterns that people think that means. That's why I say I'm these things and I'm none of these things. Here's an opening to maybe get to know me. But I always say to people, I am a mystery unto myself. So how could I possibly know who you are if I am a mystery unto myself? The me wants control, the I wants clarity. Once clarity arrives, it burns as clean as any holy flame. Being a mystery unto myself opens up all the pathways. It allows me to go down any quantum self that I choose. And you're a mystery. So I'm a mystery unto myself. You're even more of a mystery to me. And it means that I don't get to put you in a box. I don't get to identify you by some sort of tribalism. And it's funny that we talk about, vanity, for instance, right? But just think about the notion. We talked here many times, and we'll talk more about the idea that we're in a lucid dream. And when you wake up inside of a dream, when you become lucid, you come to the realization that every person that you're running into, whether you're on the street and you walk up to Mickey Mouse or Adolf Hitler, they're both you, because they're puppets of your subconscious. They don't have any autonomy. They don't have any existence outside of your understanding of who this person is. But I'm telling you, perspective, so much of that is true in our life. I think it's Malcolm Gladwell, maybe in one of his books. I've read a lot of Malcolm Gladwell, so I couldn't quote exactly where it's coming from. But he talks about these substitute teachers, I think is the situation, going into a class, and the same class, they tell two substitute teachers different things about either a particular student or all of the students. I can't remember exactly, but it holds weight. Just bear with me here. They tell one teacher, these students are terrible students. They're the worst students in the school. They're really bad. They tell the other teacher, I think they either give them a more positive, like, these are great students. Basically, the students start to inhabit the behavior that they instructed the teacher that was going into the class. So the teacher has an impact on the students. And it's partially because the students, like I said, if your voice isn't, and your choice and your I am isn't strong enough, those voices around you in your subconscious and your neuroplasticity, they'll start to absorb this, and in that gap closes that Viktor Frankl says where our power of deciding is, and you let that other person decide for you. You become weak. You can't expand that space. That's what this is about expanding that space through practice. And but when you look at this, the teachers having an impact on the students, you also have the notion that they're shaping that reality because of the way that they perceive. And so we do that with people in our lives. That's why it's best to look at yourself as a mystery and the others around you as mysteries, because they can then grow into something that you might not know. But the other part of the vanity that I wanted to talk about is we separate ourselves from the notion of being in a unified field, from being in a state of oneness in a lucid dream. And we say, well, there's me and everything else. Me and everything else. I mean, just think about if to have that idea really is absolutely almost like a megalomaniacal kind of delusion, because to say there's me and everything else has this assumption that anything that isn't specifically you is outside of you. And it's like, I think of Alan Watts in this analogy. He says, an apple comes from the earth. And we see that. It comes up from the tree and it blossoms out of the tree. When we think about our like human experience, a lot of times we say we came here as if we landed on earth, but we didn't come out of it. But there's a funny thing. I want to dive deeper into that, but it looks like we're about to run out of time, and I still want to read from Serendipity According to Francis for today. But just imagine the perspective of the dreamer, and imagine yourself more in this collective unconscious, in this collective dream. Because to say you and everything that's not you would actually be supremely vain in some capacity. But it also makes me think of the opposite version of this notion. If you look at your hand and you held your palm up and you imagine there's a grain of sand in your hand, and then you imagine all the space around your palm in your hand all the way out to your fingertips, it wouldn't be right at the center. It would look like off center. But then you start to imagine all the space in the room around you. And again, it might seem off center. But then if you go out and you imagine all the space around you in the city that you're in, it starts to appear to be more at the center. And then you go out to the state. And then, of course, you go to the globe in this sphere. And, of course, in a spherical perspective, now you're already at the center. But if you keep expanding outward infinitely, you find yourself at the center. And there's some sort of, we'll have to go over this in more detail later, but there's some sort of insane juxtaposition between self-centeredness and your self-being at the center. Because wherever you are, you're at the center of the universe. You're at the center of an infinitely expanding cosmos. If you look at it in that manner, you're always at the center. And I'm always at the center. So are we the center of attention, or are we to center our attention? That's probably the question. We'll look at that in a future episode. But right now, December 27th, I want to read from Serendipity According to Francis. It's now December 27th, 2025. And we're going to read from Serendipity According to Francis for December 27th, 2022. So here we go. This is where the magic happens. If you're not familiar, Serendipity According to Francis is a book. If you've not been following along here on the show, I wrote a book in 2022 dedicated to my dog, to the magic of serendipity in my life, and how it all happens. November 28th, I had this insane experience with the book mirroring my decision to start reading from the book 3 years later for this show. And now here it is again. Because imagine I'm skipping all of these days in the book until we get to the next week. And here we are on December 27th, only for me to come to find out that I had to go into a new journal. So I left that other journal behind. In previous episodes of reading from the book on the show, you'll know that I mentioned what the cover of the book was that I was working on or reading from at that time, because I wrote it in hand over 7 journals. And I described that book a couple of episodes back. And here we are. I'm just going to read right from December 27, 2022. How can he finish if he doesn't begin? I finished that journal, and this is the first page and what will likely be the final volume for Serendipity according to Francis. It's fitting that I got the new journal on the day of Franklin's farewell. Last night, I brought that little vial of Fran's hair up to his nose. He sniffed and sniffed. I thought it might help him. Wow, man. I'm telling you, like, I'm going to get real emotional on this. I'm just going to let it be here. Franklin was our cat. And, man, I thought it might help him find his way to her on his journey. All energy, all symbols and portals. We were taking Franklin in, and I have this little vial of Frances's hair that sits on her shelf at the house. And I remember now I brought it up to him so he could kind of, because they were buddies, you know, our cat Franklin and Francis. So all energy, all symbols and portals, totems and magic. My food and coffee are getting cold. Food doesn't taste the same in grief. Frank ate a big breakfast before we left. Just food. Whew, God, it's heavy because, like, Frank was this special needs cat, and I'm just reading the next line before I said it. Just food, none of the powders and potions, none of the pills and bitter supplements. He ate and enjoyed, like, just like that. It's raw right now and visceral for me. Just that notion that he didn't have to do those crazy supplements that he was on for his whole life. Those crazy things to help boost his immune system. It's just like he just gets to eat free this time. Eat what he wants and just taste the food by itself. And for me, I'm saying food doesn't taste the same in grief. We all know that experience. He ate and enjoyed. The past 3 days, he's tasted his food unlike any day of his life. He ate his final meal just hours before his journey home. What's it all mean? To eat and leave. That wall begins to climb around me as I write. Leaning into the hurt is never easy. Distraction, however, feels like dishonor. I understand the inclination to self-preservation. The challenge here, distinct from coping. Here, we're to wring out every tear and taste their salty truth. I could go to the gym or play video games. I could lean into my work, and I'll do all of those things. But first, I will suffer the joy. Excuse me. I will suffer the joy of Franklin Apricot. That's it. Has it ever been written in that way? Frank's purpose in a single phrase, suffer the joy. I have him to thank for that, here and now. I'm looking at the dining room table where we had some of our last visits and remember thinking then of this now, knowing in days he will be gone, but I would be here contemplating the same, communing with him. When we got home, I opened his crate as I always would, hoping his spirit came pouncing out and zooming around the house. But I remember him on the table. It was deep into the night, and I thought how strange it will be to be able to turn on the lights at night. I cook and clean the dishes like I'm Dr. Zhivago by candlelight. Because Kelly would insist that the lights hurt his eyes. You know, it's so crazy to me. This Dr. Zhivago by candlelight. I was at breakfast today with my friends Clinton and Dennis and Rob. And I mentioned to Rob how he should be writing a letter with a handwritten letter with fingerless gloves in the dark, in the cold, by candlelight, like Dr. Zhivago. I literally said that exact same thing today. This is what I'm talking about. Those are those places where we see these overlaps. It's funny because some of these days I told you I would write a page, like a literal page in a journal, a single page. And then some days I would go on and on and on. And I'm sorry for sniffling, but obviously I got some emotion happening here. But there's no way I'm going to be able to finish for December 27th and keep reading, because this is one of those days that I carried on for a very long time. So instead, I want to focus on another thing that I've meditated on many times over the years with Khalil Gibran, because Franklin brought me to that specific phrase, suffer the joy. Something that we don't think of, but if you go back to the first episode of this radio show, I talked about gratitude being a decision, gratitude being a perspective, not a feeling. And suffer the joy is about reframing these things. So Khalil Gibran, from The Prophet, my favorite book of all time, says this on joy and sorrow. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked. That's exactly what this experience that I just read through with Franklin was. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked. I talked many times about Frances, my dog, my little Pomeranian, that from the time she was a puppy, I would put myself into that contemplation, the same that I just read with Franklin. I knew his days were looming and numbered, though, at that time. But when Frances was a puppy, I would imagine the day that I wouldn't have her. I would think from that future. I would think from that future sorrow and borrow some of my joy of having her to put into my future self. And so that's what Gibran's saying here. On joy and sorrow, your joy is your sorrow unmasked. And the self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper the sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds your wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? Is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. That's exactly this idea that I was suffering Franklin's joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at a standstill and balanced. When the treasure keeper lifts you to weigh his gold and his silver, needs must your joy or your sorrow rise or fall. Khalil Gibran, The Prophet. If you don't know it, do yourself a favor, order it from Amazon or wherever you get your books from. If you do know it, read it again. It changes all the time because we change all the time because we are a mystery unto ourselves. jjweinberg.com/perspective. Saturdays at noon on WVLP.org. If you miss Saturdays, you can check out Wednesday's replay at 6 p.m. And again, find all of the episodes on YouTube and my website. Until next time.
I am versus me. Suffer the joy.
Perception is reality. Perspective shapes the world around you. I'm JJ Weinberg. This is my perspective.